Hello everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar, where we'll be introducing you to the Climate Bonds Water Criteria developed for the Climate Bonds Standard and Certification Scheme. Lily Guy, Senior Research Analyst here at Climate Bonds Initiative, and John Matthews from Alliance for Global Water Adaptation, the lead specialist for the Water Technical Working Group, are here today to talk you through these criteria. But before we begin, I'd just like to go over some basic housekeeping. The webinar will run for 1 hour and we'll have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the presentation. You can submit questions at any point during the webinar by using the Q&A panel at the top right of the webinar screen. If you're phoning in, you can submit questions by emailing them to Katie, that's K-A-T-I-E, at climatebonds.net. Everyone is muted upon entry to save on background noise. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available to participants of the webinar and on our YouTube channel shortly. Now, over to Lily to kick us off.
Thank you, Katie. Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. So I'm Lily from Climate Bonds Initiative. Today I'm going to go through some basics of the Climate Bond Standard, and John Matthews will talk about the details of our water criteria too. So let's start with the who we are and what are we doing. So Climate Bonds Initiative is an investor-focused non-for-profit mobilizing debt capital market to invest in environmental and climate solutions. So our main work streams include 3 aspects. The first one, we work closely with governments in different countries to help them develop financing plans for addressing climate change issues, and we help them to grow the green bond market as a part of the financing plan. Internationally, we also work with organizations like UNEP and OECD for developing innovative financing tools like green securitization, green covered bond, and green Islamic finance. So secondly, we also check all the green bonds issued in the market, and we have established a database which is the basis for the MSCI, Barclays, and S&P green bond indices. We also publish the annual reporting about the progress of the global green bond market globally and regionally. So thirdly, we have established Climate Bond Standard and the Certification Scheme. So the Climate Bond Standard is an environmental standard, provide science-based definitions for investors and issuers regarding what is green assets and projects. The associated certification scheme provides assurance on the green credentials of the bond. So what is green bond? So green bond is the bonds with use proceeds investing in green assets and projects that are low carbon and climate resilient. So in order to provide assurance on the green credentials, normally issuers will go through external review like second opinion or using certification scheme. And normally annual reporting on the use proceeds is also needed for transparency reasons. Green bonds can be used for new projects as well as refinancing existing projects. And because bonds are normally long-term and low risk, so most of the green bonds are using for refinancing. So for issuers, green bonds help them to diversify their investor base, bring in marketing benefits. And for investors, green bonds is essentially a labeling tool for them to identify what kind of assets projects can address climate risks. So the green bond market started in 2007 when European Investment Bank issued the first climate awareness bond. And the market started to grow rapidly since 2012. And you can see there are more diversified issuers, including municipal, development banks, corporate banks, and green asset-backed securities. Last year, the green bond issuance has reached 81 billion USD, and we think this year the green bond issuance can reach USD $130 billion. So our key focus here today is the climate bond standard and the certification scheme. Like I've just said, the climate bond standard is essentially a labeling tool for issuers and investors to identify assets and projects that are able to address climate change issues. So the climate standard consists of two parts. The first part is the climate bond standard V2.1. It details requirements regarding the management and reporting process within the issuer. And the second part is the sector-specific criteria, which identify assets and projects can deliver climate benefits. And these criteria details the requirements the assets must be met in order to be eligible for green bonds for climate bond certification. So under the climate bond standard, issuer needs to use this sector criteria to identify eligible assets and create green bond issuance framework regarding the use proceeds, management procedures, and the reporting. And then they need to engage with approved verifier. So verifier will check whether issuer has compliance with the climate bond standard, and if so, CBI will issue a certificate for green bond issuer. Then the issuer can go to the market with the certified climate bond mark. And within the 12 months of the issuance, the verifier needs to check again whether at the post-issuance stage, issuer still meet the climate bond standard requirements, and if so, issuer can get a post-issuance certificate. Issuers are also required to report annually regarding the use of proceeds for transparency purpose. So we have been developing sector criteria in 8 areas and a variety of sectors, including energy, transport, water, low carbon buildings, etc. And to date, we have 11 sector criteria available to use. And the development of criteria process normally are involved a couple of stages. Firstly, we will prepare some background research and recruit technical working group members. And the second stage, we will convene the technical working group members, and these TWG members will meet monthly to discuss details of the criteria. And thirdly, we convene industry working group from potential issuer, verifier, and financier to test the draft criteria developed by TWG. After that, we will start 6-day public consultation to see whether the criteria are feasible to use or not. And after public consultation, if we have major issues we need to address, we will reconvene the TWG to address its comments. After that, we will submit the document to our climate bond standards board for approval. If our board approves the criteria, then we can release the criteria to the market. So specifically for water criteria, there are over 50 organizations involved in the development, so including AQUA, OECD, Sirius, and the WBC, SD, etc. So our water criteria has been developed into 2 phases. The phase 1 covered engineered water infrastructure for water collection, storage, treatment, distribution, flood protection, or drought resilience. And the phase 1 criteria is released to the market in October 2016. So 3 green bonds issued by San Francisco Utility Public Commission and the City of Cape Town have been certified under the phase 1 criteria. The phase 2 criteria covered nature-based and hybrid water infrastructure, including such as infrastructure for water collection, storage, treatment, distribution, flood and drought resilience. And now the phase 2 criteria are open for public consultation. So just to give you some example of the assets covered by phase 2 criteria. So for water storage, such as active snowpack management program, for flood defenses like restoration of riparian wetlands for flood storage, drought defenses such as use of pumps to transfer waters. So you can find more details of the scope of the assets we covered in the documents on our website. So that's pretty much the scope of the water phase 2 criteria. And regarding the specific requirements, the water criteria have established 2 components. The first component is about mitigation. This is to ensure the water infrastructure projects certified by our standards will be low carbon. And the second component is about adaptation and resilience. So this component is to make sure the water infrastructure projects can address climate change risks. And this component has a scorecard for issuer to use to demonstrate that their projects are resilient to climate change. So the scorecard consists of 5 sections, including allocation, governance, technical diagnostics, nature-based solutions, and assessment of the adaptation plan. So the section 4 is specific for phase 2 criteria, i.e. the nature-based and hybrid infrastructure. So now I will hand it over to John for the details of the water criteria.
Hi, I'm John Matthews. I'm with the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation, AGWA, and AGWA has helped convene the industry and technical working groups, and then my role in this process is to serve as something like the midwife to take the different ideas, comments, and try to synthesize them, organize them into sets of criteria that can then be circulated back out for additional comment and discussion. That's what we'll be talking about for the next few slides. So as Lily was saying, there are 2 basic steps. The first step is focused on mitigation, and really the most important aspects that we're talking about here are that either that there's no impact from a climate mitigation perspective, that's greenhouse gases, if positive or negative, or ideally that there's a slight decrease or more in greenhouse gas emissions. So we would like to see things that are carbon neutral or carbon reducing in reasonable terms. Step 2 is more complicated, and the criteria really explore this step in much more detail. The idea here is that most water investments are long-lived, and thus they will be exposed to potentially significant climate impacts over their lifetime, so they need to be resilient to those impacts and to be able to continue to deliver those services. And also, we hope that their relationship with their ambient environment is also a resilient one, so that, for instance, as water conditions change, that ecosystems are not unduly harmed with those ongoing shifts. The 2 basic requirements in keeping with what we believe are the standard for the design, construction, and operation of water investments globally are to conduct a climate vulnerability assessment to explore the potential for climate impacts, and if climate impacts of significance have been identified, then to be able to score the adaptation plan. So you really need to be able to have the vulnerability assessment, a kind of diagnosis, and if treatment is necessary, then essentially a treatment regime. What have you done in response? And notice the emphasis here that we're looking for long-lived infrastructure. So we're looking for, say, as a baseline, something that's going to last 20 years or more. And this is in keeping with where we see most of the major institutions that are progressive thinkers on climate issues and environmental issues. For instance, the World Bank, since at least 2015, has been following these guidelines for their water investments. Okay, there we go. There are 5 sections. Sections 1, 2, 3, and 5 are from phase 1. So they were developed and put out just about a year ago with that work, and all projects should complete those sections. Over the last year and a half, we've been working intensively on Section 4. Altogether, about 130, 140 people from a very wide variety of technical and industry perspectives, disciplines, and institutions have given input on one level or another to all these sections. I'll go into some detail on 1, 2, 3, and 5, and a little more detail on Section 4. Sections 1, 2, and 3 on this slide. Allocation. Water allocation is basically how you divide water among stakeholders in a given system. And here we're looking at 2 different levels. We're looking at the scale of the project itself. So who are the immediate stakeholders that water is divided among, including ecosystems themselves, perhaps significant parts of the ecosystem. But we also feel that it's important to be able to reflect upwards at a basin scale. We think that is also in keeping with the emerging best practices from an environmental perspective and from a climate perspective. Essentially, what we want to make sure is that those allocation arrangements are going to be robust and flexible in keeping with shifting water conditions. Volumetric relationships, for instance, would be heavily discounted as inflexible and quite rigid, as you might see with the Colorado Compact currently. Section 2, it focuses on governance. What that really means is how do you, those stakeholders negotiate with one another? Can they avoid conflict? Can they reduce a potential conflict? If changes are necessary or new stakeholders are added, how are those arrangements shifted? So governance is absolutely critical. Overall, sections 1 and 2 are really about the flexibility of the system. We think it's very critical for how we deal with the uncertainties around the timing and types of impacts that we can expect to see from climate in the future. Section 3 focuses, for lack of a better phrase, on what we've called technical diagnostics. So what is the analytical strength that's gone into being able to prepare the assessment of climate impacts? Is there a hydrological model that exists for that system? Most of this is really quite standard for engineered and green and hybrid infrastructure projects, and it would be really of serious concern if there was a weakness in this area. Okay, section 4 is the newest section, nature-based solutions, and there are 2 kind of baseline items that are described that you need to meet in advance. Essentially saying you will prioritize existing systems or the restoration of existing systems over creating new ecosystems. There are several subsections here, basically checking to make sure that you understand the ecosystems that are there, that you know something about how they're managed, how they can be managed, and their broader setting. So looking to site inventory, do we know what's there? Do we have a sense of what the ecosystem looks like when it's healthy and how it might be able to change over time in response to climate or other types of drivers? Do we have very much data that's available? More data should be associated with more effective management. what are the broader ecosystem impacts? How do we understand what's happening upstream and downstream, for instance? And then, do we have a sense of how the monitoring and management processes work? Do we have levers that we can press? Do we understand the changes in hydrology or in the flow regime? Lastly, is Section 5, the Adaptation Plan. And again, this is not necessary if climate hasn't been identified as a significant issue for the system. If there are one or more climate impacts that have been seen in the previous sections, in the vulnerability sections, that look like they're important, then you need to be able to say, this is how they will be addressed and managed into the future. Scoring is on a binary process, 1 or 0. We set a threshold of 60% for each section, and you must score 60% or more in all sections in order to be able to pass. That is a number that we keep our finger on. We may decide to increase it in the future, but so far all the projects that we've scored have been quite high scoring, and this may be something that we look at again, and we're certainly open to comments here, but that's what we've decided so far. It's our best guess about where to start with quite a novel set of criteria. The assessment verification process is really a kind of dialogue that goes on between the issuer and verifier. We also insist on documentation. We would like this to be a transparent process, and we prepared a scoring guide that really guides people in effectively putting together a dossier that shows how the items are reflected and justified for each of the scores. We welcome your questions, and we're going to have a second webinar in case you can't get enough of this one, or you have friends, relatives that need to attend a second one. So we'd love to hear your thoughts, comments about the process, the criteria, whatever might be of interest to you.
Thank you, John. Yeah, so we'll now open up to a Q&A. We've had some questions already coming through, but just to remind everyone, you can submit your questions. If you look at the top right-hand corner of the webinar platform, there's a Q&A box there. If you click that, you can submit questions via there, and then I will read them out to Lily and John. But to kick us off now, first of all, a question about the two-stage process on that diagram that you showed. Do issuers need to meet both the mitigation and the adaptation and resilience requirements under the water criteria?
Yes. It's important to meet both. On the adaptation resilience side, the two optional sections are Section 4 and Section 5. Section 4 is for green and hybrid projects, and Section 5 is the Adaptation Plan. So it's possible that you might just fulfill Section 1 on the mitigation side, and Section 2, Step 2, Sections 1, 2, and 3.
Thanks, John. And now a kind of more general question. What types of projects are you expecting to see using this phase 2 of the criteria?
Lily might have an expanded answer. A lot of the projects that I've seen have been from public utilities, and but even then they have spanned quite a variety of projects. For instance, the first issuance from San Francisco focused on stormwater systems, and it actually involved some green and hybrid elements in that issuance. And their second issuance that came a few months later was primarily about water delivery, water storage. There actually was a fund for ongoing long-term ecological restoration processes and projects inside the basin. There was some hard infrastructure, water conveyance and transport systems. For the green infrastructure projects, we anticipate projects around flood control, water treatment, potentially some drought and more stormwater elements. Lily, am I missing big things?
I think that sounds good, John. And I just want to add that the water criteria is for all types of water infrastructure, but not only those who build specific for addressing climate change like floods or drought defense. So our aim is to build the help the project developer to build the right process in place. So I think in future, all types of water infrastructure should consider the climate change impact that their projects are facing to, and also they need to think about their greenhouse gas emission profile in order to be low carbon.
Thanks, Lily and John. Now, a question about the kind of feedback that you're looking for on these criteria. Are there specific questions or specific parts of the criteria that you're looking for feedback on, or is it just general feedback on Section 4?
That's a great question. I'd say that we're open to feedback throughout. What we're most interested in, however, is on Section 4, the green and hybrid projects. We feel like that's the newest part. It's we're pretty far ahead of the curve with the other sections, but they've also weathered a lot and been tested, and we feel pretty confident about it. But we're very open to comments there too. But certainly, what we're most eager for is in Section 4. Thank you.
Thanks, John. And one now kind of on the size of these bonds compared to the size of the nature bonds compared to what you might see under the sort of more grey infrastructure. Can you imagine that these bond issuances will be smaller than those for green bonds under the big grey infrastructure, or is that not the case?
I see that my friend Monica has asked that. Nice to see you on the call. I think that's probably a reasonable guess, but it's also hard to say. We're not expecting, for instance, in the hydropower projects that are going to be issued as green or hybrid. That's actually those are all being channeled through a different set of criteria that are being developed separately. I actually happen to be in Manila in the Philippines right now, across the street from the Asian Development Bank at a 3-day workshop looking at how they can start to develop their own green hybrid infrastructure projects more formally through their system. And I think their experience so far has been, yes, these are somewhat smaller projects. I think that's probably more generally true, but I think we might also see some surprises. For instance, the fund that San Francisco Public Utility Commission set up, it was a pretty good sized fund. I think it was about 50 million or something for their system level ecological restoration work. I thought it was a really creative system. I also think it would be very interesting to potentially apply this at the level of say an environmental flows project, being able to set that up across a basin or a significant part of a basin. You can imagine a utility like Charles River Water Authority in the eastern U.S., or maybe some of the large river systems in Europe pursuing that. And those could be quite large projects.
Thanks, John. And now a question more generally about green bonds. What's the biggest challenge to the future of green bonds? I'm going to pass that one to Lily.
Okay. I think the biggest challenge is always the lack of green bond issuance. So we are working closely with investors, and we are trying to mobilize their capital to invest in green bonds or green assets. But the problem for them is, although they got green mandates, so the mandate that they need to invest in green bonds, there's actually a lack of green bond issuance in the market. So I think market education is really important to increase the scale of the green bond market. So well, there are two separate issues under this issue. The first one is awareness of climate change. We definitely need to do more education for project developers, for them to consider that climate change risks is real and will have a huge impact on their physical assets. And also we need to help issuers to realize their green bond issuance opportunities. So a lot of project developers, they already have opportunity to issue green bonds, like for railway, for buildings, for water infrastructure, of course, but they may not realize that they can actually use these assets to issue green bonds in the market.
Thanks, Lily. And then going back to more specific on the water criteria, there was mention of a scorecard and a checklist during the criteria requirements. Who should do the scoring there? John, do you want to take that one?
Sure. The primary responsibility for the preparation is really on the issuer. They need to be able to assemble the necessary documents. So they do bear some burden in terms of the transaction costs on the preparation side. I've had some experience with this now. I'm an aquatic ecologist that's I've been sort of sucked into this a strange world of finance, but it's been really interesting to actually work with the issuers that we've had so far on that scoring process and see how it works. And I actually think that that's potentially one of the obstacles that happens with green and climate bonds, is that because they are fairly holistic in their vision, that you're often connecting parts of a single organization that they don't talk to each other that much. So some of the allocation and governance issues, for instance, may seem very simple, even facile to say a legal team or some of the regulatory staff inside of an issuer, but they may seem very exotic and strange to a CFO. So in my experience, it's the CFO, the finance team, is probably going to be the primary point group in being able to put that together. They need to work with a verifier that will help them hopefully answer questions with them. And what we saw in the Cape Town issuance, the most recent one, I was really pleased to actually not be involved in that. KPMG did the verification process. They found the phase 1 criteria quite clear, and were able to guide the city of Cape Town very easily to, I thought, an excellent scoring process. So hope that answers your question. Please correct me if I missed the mark.
Thank you, John. And actually that leads on quite nicely to another question that's come through, which is for the certifications that have already been done under phase 1, what are the types of assets and projects that have been included in those bonds?
It's been very diverse. The largest issuance, actually, it was San Francisco, and it was an 800 million US issuance, and I think that it had something like 85 different sub-projects. So that is one that I helped with the scoring process directly, so I had to learn quite a bit about San Francisco's water delivery systems. which was the bulk of that work. So it went San Francisco's utility actually is both a water service utility, and because they depend a great deal on hydropower, it's also an electricity utility, and they have kind of a mixed system. So in the components of that particular issuance, it went everywhere along from the big storage reservoir that was up in the Sierra Nevada to the east of San Francisco, to their relationship with many of the groups, the cities or other entities, including corporations, that they allocate water to. They have very complicated allocation arrangements and governance, as you can imagine, along something like a 150-kilometer route, and then a series of smaller reservoirs, some of which are also natural lakes or constructed lakes that are on the peninsula where San Francisco is. There were also some innovative water treatment systems that they were implementing, a number of which had actually no relationship to adaptation or resilience. They were putting in, for instance, a microwave, antibacterial, antiviral water treatment system in one facility, a bunch of command and control systems, some analytical processes. All that stuff is not really that relevant to the criteria, nor should it really be. But then there are some excellent monitoring systems. There were a few kind of hybrid aspects to the system in terms of some wetland treatment that were combined with gray treatment systems, and then just a lot of water conveyance systems. I fully expect also a great deal of projects that are maybe more in line with their first issuance that focus very much on stormwater. It's a very common type of project. So stormwater is really also a type of a flood issue, so both coastal flooding and inland flooding. We think that that's especially a really important area for green and hybrid systems. So you can imagine a combination of wetlands and levees or dikes. That seems to be a lot of what we've been talking about so far in an Asian context here in Manila this week so far. I've been really impressed with the kind of creativity, but I've also each issuance I want to add. I felt like as an individual I've learned something too. I've been surprised, always pleasantly so, by the types of components that have been presented, and I expect that that's going to continue for some time.
Thank you, John. And then a question that I'll go to Lily. Is hydropower included in these water criteria?
So we have separate technical working group for hydro criteria because hydropower essentially have power generation within the normally within the facility. So we have a separate group to discuss the issues in hydropower. So we are in the process of developing a criteria for hydropower, and essentially we will have three components to address the greenhouse gas emissions from hydropower facilities and climate resilient and adaptation issues, as well as other environmental social impacts, because some large hydro projects are quite controversial. So we would like to establish more requirements regarding broader environmental and social impacts.
Thank you, Lily. And then continuing along the theme of what can be covered by these, if an issuer comes with a bond that has proceeds for projects in different sectors other than water, how would that work under these criteria or under the certification scheme more generally?
So it depends on what types of assets issuer has. So if there are multiple different types of assets, then they need to meet different sector criteria. So if they have water infrastructure in their portfolio, then their water projects need to meet water criteria. And for instance, if they have mixed with solar, wind, or other bioenergy criteria, then they need to meet solar, wind, and bioenergy criteria as well.
Thank you, Lily. And then a question about phase 2. Why are we now adding phase 2 to phase 1 as the water criteria? John, do you want to take that one first?
Sure. Well, our sense of how the market is going is that infrastructure is really viewed very broadly now, that it's a kind of continuum from gray to green, and that green infrastructure systems are not really completely separate, that they actually should be treated maybe more normalized. That's probably the word that I'm looking for in the context of how we think about water investments. It's usually the same entities that are preparing these and assembling these as either investments or as specific to fulfill the same types of solutions that you would expect historically from gray infrastructure. There are some exceptions. There's someone posted here a very thoughtful question about blue carbon, actually, that I thought was interesting. Blue carbon is not really something that you could take care of in the context of gray infrastructure, and that is something that we've given a lot of thought to for this issuance. And blue carbon, if you're not aware of it, is a way of trying to think about how to store carbon in ecosystems. And there are some types of aquatic or coastal marine systems that have been proposed by groups such as IUCN, the Ramsar Convention, and Conservation International, among others, as a mechanism to be able to sequester greenhouse gases in permanent or semi-permanent form, essentially through a kind of biogeological process. So seagrasses, for instance, in estuaries and nearshore coastal systems. Some of you who work in the tropics might be familiar with tropical peatlands as a reservoir of carbon that can either be added to or removed from. There's not really a gray infrastructure version of that. So that is a somewhat more unique approach. And we actually would really welcome comments on if blue carbon should be a part of these phase 2 criteria. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, John. So we've got about 10 minutes left, so if people have more questions, make sure you're submitting them via the Q&A. I've got a couple more to go through. What evidence would we expect issuers to provide to the verifier to prove compliance with these criteria?
That's a very good question. So in terms of some of the topics, such as allocation and governance, often a regulatory framework is quite adequate to be able to show statutory arrangements. You know, an issuer very often is not going to be responsible for arranging that itself. In some countries with a weak regulatory framework, it may be more necessary to show that some type of mechanism has been created. even in very highly developed water regulatory frameworks, however, you still see some kind of innovative components. For instance, there is an environmental flows arrangement for the Delaware River in eastern North America that was put together that is separate from the local, state, interstate, and national water regulations, and kind of emerges from the basin users. There's one for the Potomac as well in the DC area. There are others in Europe for many of the major rivers. The Danube, for instance, very complicated allocation arrangements. Being able to show verification of participation in groups like that, or the existence of these kinds of groups is important. And a lot of that is actually quite accessible over the internet to be able to document and show. One thing that's important is to be able for the issuer to show that there has been some type of analysis that has been conducted to look for climate risk. That is very often and very typically comes out of a technical team within that issuer. So it's often a group of engineers, hydrologists, geographers, maybe even some social scientists that are involved in that process. Again, this sometimes serves as kind of a barrier within these institutions. One of my very first experiences actually in trying to learn about how we could develop useful criteria, informative criteria, I emailed a CFO at a large utility, a very progressive utility, and I said, you have issued a bond that makes lots of claims about reducing climate risk and current and future climate impacts. And I said, can you show me how you assess those impacts? Do you have a vulnerability assessment? And he called me almost immediately and said, is that normal? Do these things exist? And I said, just trust me, call your engineering department and see what they say. And he called me back just a couple of hours later and said, you were right, they do exist, they are there. But that, I think, just reflects the kind of newness of finance staff and thinking about the implications of adaptation and resilience and how these risks are taken into account. So in a sense, there's a kind of education component, we think, a capacity building aspect of this work. So I hope that answered your question.
Thanks, John. And then another question on the adaptation and resilience requirements. Is it only projects with an operational lifetime of more than 20 years that need to meet the adaptation and resilience requirements?
That's an excellent question. I'd say that this is potentially something that we might also change in the future, but we're trying to go by what we have been able to perceive as the emerging best practices. So, and that here we're explicitly following some of the big development banks that we think have put into place some effective safeguards. So the World Bank is a very close partner of AGWA. We've actually have been able to follow their development over the past 5 or 6 years of their climate risk framework for water investments. And their opinion, I think, with a lot of justification, was that 20 years is a reasonable point for looking at exposure. That we can probably assess risk fairly accurately for a 20-year period. Beyond 20 years, the role of climate is probably more important. And they've had several billion that they've run through that risk framework over the past couple of years, so that they still feel pretty good about it. We've also run that very explicitly through our industry and technical working groups. We don't want to present a huge burden, so relatively short-lived projects. It makes sense, I think, to say, you know, they probably have relatively low thresholds lower thresholds they need to meet in order to be resilient. But we certainly welcome your comments on it if you have a different opinion.
Thanks, John. So I think that brings us to the end of our Q&A. I'm just double checking that there's no more questions that have come through. But so that brings us to the end of the Q&A, and so to the end of the webinar. Many thanks to all of those who have joined us today, and thanks so much for your questions. It's all really helpful feedback. Also, and some people have been submitting thoughts on the criteria while we've been speaking, so great to have that as well, and I'll be combining that and feeding it into the public consultation feedback. John and Lily, thanks for walking us through the criteria and for answering all the questions. Public consultation for these criteria closes on the 14th of December, so if anyone has any further thoughts, feedback or questions, please send them to Lily at her email. It's lily@climatebonds.net. As John mentioned before, we're holding a second webinar for any of those that didn't hear about this one in time or weren't able to join. That's going to be on Monday, the 20th of November, 4 p.m. GMT. The links to register are all up on the Climate Bonds website, so if you know anyone that would be interested to join, please do share that around. We've also been recording this, and we will make that available on our YouTube channel. We will send around a link to all those who have registered. So thanks very much for joining, and we look forward to hearing any further feedback. Bye.